The biggest experience I've found is a positive experience, and that's how the private and public sector have genuinely worked together, sharing different ideas and different perspectives on solutions to some of the very interesting questions that have been asked during the, is it 8 or 9 months we've been working together now?
I think it's a question of the different types of pressure. I think in government you tend to find that you get almost the pressures of fashion, in that people focus on particular things and expect you to make changes against those particular things, whereas in fact you should perhaps be addressing them all the time. And you get those kind of pressures for continuous change in industry. So I think industry is more used to the management of continuous change than you'd find inside government.
The fascination of working with a set of people who represent elements of key functions into the community of which I'm part, but seeing it from a completely different perspective. And I think that, for me, has been one of the most edifying parts of my engagement, is to actually understand how the community of which not only myself but my business is part of, seeing a much more strategic and comprehensible view of why things sometimes are as they are. Whereas often from the ground, you see it in an incomplete way. And I think talking to some of the people who have the strategic responsibility for delivering has been a revelation in some ways to me.
Well, we've had a great workshop this morning, and Paul Walker from Malvern Instruments just completely turned the whole project perspective on its head. He's bringing a business perspective on how he would deal with a problem. And his solution was to put somebody in charge, somebody responsible, somebody who's accountable for the budget for the project. And quite often that isn't the same response that you would get from a classical public sector person or leader. But certainly I think they've given a different perspective to solutions to problems we've been asked. Certainly one of the projects I'm working with Bosch and Richard Soper in particular is how Bosch can work closer with the education establishments, and they're starting a project with Tudor Grange, which Richard thinks can be duplicated with every big business and every school across Worcestershire.
Well, this is obviously a very different thing. So the first thing is why one actually engages in this kind of way. And there's a perception really of the difference of the public sector and the private sector. We all actually live in the same community. I mean, Kinetic has been, under different names, part of the Worcestershire community since World War II. So you tend to think of yourself as being a part of this and try to work out how to engage and how to work together towards the environment we all share.
I think people who are engaged with leaders of the councils of the health service, these are immensely difficult and challenging roles to deliver enormous budgets through complex organisations that are constrained by legislation in a way that most private industry frankly isn't. And I think one of the things that generates in the private sector is a difference of approach to almost every problem. And I hope, if there's been anything of value I brought to the Shenstone, along with my private sector colleagues, it is in approaching problems from a different perspective, and in doing so perhaps catalyse a different solution than would otherwise have been derived, I think.
Part of it's the business brain, but business brains are also partly about the business you come from, which in the case of Kinetic is a technology business. So therefore we've tended to think in terms of what we can contribute to the community with that kind of speciality. So hence the kind of volunteering we do, for example, is STEM ambassadors to the local schools and working with the local universities and things of this sort. And also, too, about economic issues, because Worcestershire is really, in many ways, transitioning from a farming community. And one has to think about the kind of industrial structural move to what creates prosperity, things of this sort, and where you sit inside that. Because those kind of macro issues are quite important to companies as well. Because that's a question of where customers are, where suppliers are, how you locate. All those things play, and they're all part of the same thing. It's about fit into a wider community. Difference is good. If you bring together a whole series of people who think in the same way, all they're going to do is compare notes and agree with the way they're currently thinking. There's huge benefit in bringing in diversity. Now, the diversity may not even be totally appropriate. It might not be totally matched to the circumstance, but it triggers different ways of thinking. And if one's trying to make important changes, you want to scan the range of possibilities really quite carefully. So bringing in people from a diverse background is really quite helpful, almost independent of that diversity.
I think the business sector, the private sector, many people in my roles have, as I said earlier, an incomplete understanding of the dynamics and constraints of the public sector, and it creates frustration, I think, sometimes that we will see in various ways. That tends to make them step away from any likelihood of engagement or being involved in this sort of project. And I think local councils, county councils, and indeed the public sector need to understand that perspective in order to approach the private sector in a particular way to prompt the engagement that we have here. And I can only assume that polarisation exists elsewhere, and I'm sure it does, but the means of communicating in order to bring together the two elements perhaps is incomplete or imperfect at this point.
I think clarity of objectives is a key thing, because people tend to think in terms of quite complex interacting objectives. And until you've resolved them down to a few clear things that you must achieve, in a sense prioritise them, rationalise them, it can be rather unclear how one would actually develop any kind of solution. So increased focus on what you're really trying to achieve is something which is perhaps more of an industry characteristic. Another one would be the idea that you make a necessary change in response to a stimulus. Take for example the current debate on which areas are perhaps producing the best social output for the money versus the least in the Shenstone debate. And the kind of thinking there seems to be driven by the idea that what you do is you find the ones which are the least effective, you need to make a cut, like 20%, so you take those, you chop out the least effective ones till you reach 20%. That's actually a slightly odd way of looking at it from an industry point of view. From an industry point of view, you'd be continuously doing these kind of changes. They wouldn't occur in discrete steps. You'd always be doing them. And why, if you think you have expenditure which isn't creating as much social benefit as another expenditure, why wouldn't you go far beyond 20%, then reinvest the extra saving you've made in a productive area? Now that would be a reflex action in industry.
Why would you exclude part of the community? You've got experience, knowledge, skills, and they are part of the community. So include them. Why would you exclude that amount of intellectual expertise? They bring a different perspective to the party, and they want to be engaged. Engage them. It's been great. The whole experience has been great.